Cuba, China-US relations, the US presidential race, the Zika virus. We explore all of these big stories with our Reporters Roundtable. Hello, I'm Nathan King, in for Anand Naidu, and you are watching The Heat. Hello. Once a month on The Heat, we sit down with a panel of our fellow journalists and take a look at some of the headlines grabbing the stories. Joining our round table from Havana is Cristina Escobar, Cuban journalist, and Juan Guan here in the studio is our chief political correspondent for CCTV's Mandarin service. From Sao Paulo, in Brazil, we have Sam Cowie, a freelance journalist who has worked for Al Jazeera, Deutsche Welle, and many others. And a friend of the show, Richard Fowler, is here in the studio, host of his own nationally syndicated radio show, The Richard Fowler Show. Thanks so much for joining us all around these datelines. Cristina, I want to start with you in Havana. Historic announcement, obviously, that US President Barack Obama will be the first US president in some 80 years to visit Cuba. How's this going down in Cuba?
Well, it's going to be very interesting, this visit. As you just said, 88 years ago was the last and only visit of a president in exercise to visit this country. Calvin Coolidge actually was in 1928, and now we're having Barack Obama here for 2 whole days, 21st and 22nd. It's going to be quite interesting. He says he wants to know the Cuban reality, and that's quite an opportunity because shows that it's possible to come to Cuba, that it's possible for a U.S. president to come to Cuba, and it's a way to push his legacy about this new relation between Cuba and the U.S., which is not over, taking into consideration the embargo is still in place and has a lot of opponents, people against this policy inside the U.S. But it's quite an interesting perspective. He is going to be very welcomed. He's well known in Cuba, and of course we Cubans are very excited that this is also an acknowledge of our system, of our country, and also about how we're dealing things with the world and with the U.S.
Cristina, I want to follow up. I was lucky enough to be in Havana, as you know, when the flag was raised at the U.S. Embassy, when diplomatic relations were restored. But this is a step further. What's the average Cuban on the street in Havana thinking ahead of this visit? And what are they expecting from this new relationship with the United States?
Well, there's two, it could be narrowed down to 2 positions. First of all, excitement, because there are 2 million Cubans in the U.S., and it's too close, we're too close to be that kind of enemies, and it's quite important to feel that we are in a more comfortable position now with the U.S. But the other position, I would say, and it has reasons in our history, has to do with certain reluctancy there is still to trust to the U.S., to trust to the intentions that the U.S. has with this new relation with Cuba. And if this new policy means that it will mean that the U.S. government and the U.S. interest would respect the Cuban government, the Cuban sovereignty, and the decision of 11 million Cubans like me that live here in this island, and not just try to change Cuba because they just want to do it. They have to consult the essential things that Cuba has to change. It's up to the Cubans, not to the U.S. And that kind of dialogue is not still very clear. But I would say that in general, the visit of the President Barack Obama would push good intentions in both ways. In those people that believe this is a good thing, and also the people that are still a little reluctant to believe that the U.S. has very good intentions with Cuba. There's a lot of opportunities, and the idea is to take advantage of those opportunities, even though, of course, there are always risks. In this new relation, Cuba has never had normal relations with the U.S., and that's something we will have to invent in the future.
Also this week, President Barack Obama here in the U.S. saying that he wants to close Guantanamo Bay prison again. His final chance, perhaps, after pledging to close it within his first year of office, is going to go into his 8th year of office. Does he have a chance?
Yeah, I think he definitely has a chance to close it this time around. I think what was holding him up over and over again was obstruction in the United States Congress. But let's talk about...
That's still there, right?
It's still there, but I think he'll get over it this time. But let's talk about the facts in this closing in Guantanamo Bay, is that George Bush had released a good majority of the prisoners prior to the president even taking office. From when the election started, the campaign started, when George was still in the White House till Obama was sworn in, about 400 of the prisoners were already released back to their home countries.
There's 91 left now.
Right, so there's a very, very small number left. I do believe before the president leaves this White House on January 20th, 2017, you will see Guantanamo Bay closed.
Wang Guan, you know, internationally, Guantanamo Bay has been a thorn on the side of America's established position of being pro-human rights across the world. What is China and the region thinking about it?
Well, actually, in fact, some people may not realize this, but China has a stake in it. You know, think about it. China's western restive Uyghur region. China has some of its nationals held up in the Guantanamo Bay and then did not go through a fair trial. So basically, if you listen to China's foreign ministry, and their position was this was a double standard for the U.S. You know, when there was a mass theater shooting here, for example, domestically, people get the Miranda's rights, they get the due process. Whereas, you know, a foreign national who was suspected of committing terrorism was tried in a military court. So oftentimes you hear Beijing asking, how would America feel if their own citizens were tried in another country's military trial without the Miranda's rights, the due process?
And Spain's attempts to arrest Donald Rumsfeld and others goes into that. Cristina, obviously this looks very interesting from where you are in Havana. Guantanamo Bay, the base, of course, is on Cuban soil, a complicated relationship. They want to close the prison, but there's no real movement on the U.S. giving that base back to Cuba, which, of course, is a big issue for national sovereignty there.
Well, that's quite interesting because in all that discussion about the prison and the prisoners and the human rights issues about Guantanamo, no one talks that actually Guantanamo Bay is in a territory that the Cuban government is been reclaiming that is Cuban and not from the U.S. to just do whatever the U.S. government wants. And this is quite one of the problems and one of the steps that has to be taken care of in order to normalize relations has to do with the blockade, with embargo, but also with the territory illegally occupied. That's what the Cuban government says in Guantanamo. Actually, and you were talking about Donald Trump, he showed that he doesn't know anything about foreign policy when he said that Cuba was cashing checks paid by the U.S. by that territory. Actually, the U.S. pays, but the Cuban government doesn't cash those checks because they don't recognize the existence and actually the occupying illegally of this territory.
Let's move on to China now, because we had a really quite interesting and historic visit by Wang Yi, the Chinese foreign minister, here to the U.S. It's the third time he's met with John Kerry or people higher than that in just a matter of weeks. Huge shuttle diplomacy. Of course, the result was this united resolution against the DPRK's nuclear ambitions. Wang Guan, you've been following this story all the time. What was the takeaway from this visit?
You can tell that meeting 3 times in a month, the State Department and China's Foreign Ministry have a cordial, have a good personal as well as professional working relationship that really helps them solve some issues. But this is really a two-track relationship. On the diplomatic and economic side, like I said, they have good personal relationships on the leadership level, as well as good professional dialogue mechanisms. But on the security side, you hear Secretary Carter of the Pentagon specifying China as the most stressing competitor, and also, Commander Harris of PACOM has hostile remarks. The
Pacific Command leader. Yeah, it's very interesting because you have two powers coming together to really chart the way forward on sanctions with DPRK and their nuclear ambitions, which was quite impressive considering the differences they have on this issue anyway. And then this South China Sea issue keeps on cropping up. And of course the US says that China is militarizing the South China Sea, but from the Chinese point of view, it's the US that are stepping up military action in the South China Sea. That's right.
Well, here's the thing. I'm sure in the classroom of Vietnamese students or Filipino students or the Chinese students, they all hand a map out there, showing those territories are their own. But the thing is, what China feels that at least the U.S. should recognize that there are more than one claimants to those territories, and U.S.
sometimes
should
5 or 6.
Yeah, the U.S. should stick to what it says. That is, it does not take sides with regard to sovereignty. But Commander Harris of PACOM said specifically that he does not believe that those islands belong to China, which is a deviation from the official U.S. position. So basically, the biggest issue China has is that the U.S. should at least be impartial.
Do you think there's any sign of consensus on this?
Well, basically from this trip, you see both Kerry and Wang Yi stating the positions they have been stating previously. basically they can only agree to disagree at this point on South China Sea.
I think this is the distinction. I think if you put, like, you couple with the president going to Cuba and you couple it with what you're seeing from the State Department re our relationship with China, this is a complete shift in foreign policy from both George W. Bush and what the Republican candidate is saying on the field. What the president is committed to is not being the world's version of the Mean Girls and have real lasting conversation with folks, right? And the only way, and what the president understands and what John Kerry understands, is the only way we can truly create sustainable world peace is through dialogue and conversation, right? So in the case of South Korea, in the case of North Korea rather, we've got to talk to the Chinese to make sure we can really normalize that particular peninsula. In the case of Cuba, the president opening up travel is one step in the right direction to bring corporations in. The corporations are going to be the ones to move to get rid of the embargo. The farmers in Iowa, trust me, want this embargo gone so they can sell goods into Cuba. Marriott, Hyatt, every hotel is chomping at the bit to get into Cuba.
You know, I want to add quickly, 40% of the corns in Iowa that I just visited on the campaign trail are sold to the Chinese. So
Absolutely.
think about what the U.S.-China rapprochement gave the two sides. So people think that if the U.S. and Cuba can solve their issues,
But when
things
it comes to
can
China, Richard just talked about diplomacy, but when it comes to China, there has been a really sort of interesting defense and military response. This pivot was meant to be very diplomatic and economic, but a lot of people in the region see a military response as forefront, right?
Right, there are still 70,000 U.S. military troops in Okinawa, Japan, Korea, Philippines, and the Pentagon is really upgrading their capabilities and the forward deployment posture. So Beijing feels that, I know sometimes this really provoked Beijing to act in a way that it otherwise wouldn't. I mean, China is very, like any other country, very nationalistic sometimes. So if you provoke China and then encircle it, you might provoke it to act in a way.
And I want to push back on that a little bit, because I think what you're seeing from the United States, and I'm not saying I agree with the military buildup in the region, but I think the military buildup has less to do with Beijing and more to do with Pyongyang and really trying to get their hands around what is happening with Kim Jong-un and how do they sort of, at best, contain him, because he is it's one of the most likely scenarios of nuclear war globally. And I think his development of nuclear weapons and the fact that North Korea is so closed off to the rest of the world besides China is what the America sees as a problem that they've got to solve. And I think it's a top priority for the State Department.
I agree, but I think this communist China fear-mongering is still there. It's not out in the open, but it's still there. If you talk to the intelligence community, if they talk to you at all, and the military folks, the military folks, some of them, they still think that, I agree, North Korea might be a more imminent threat for the U.S.
But also North Korea is right on China's border, and of course any military build-up by the U.S. there obviously worries people in Beijing as well. Fascinating discussion. We've still got lots more, but we're going to have to take a break. Coming up, will the U.S. see Donald Trump as a president? It's possible. Our Reporters Roundtable weighs in after the break. Stay with us. Welcome back. 14 new cases of the Zika virus in the United States are being investigated as possibly transmitted through sexual contact, raising more questions about the impact of the virus. We'll get to that in a bit. But first, a third straight victory for Donald Trump in the race for the White House has given the billionaire businessman new momentum on his path to his party's nomination. The election is getting heated. Let's have a listen from Thursday night's debate.
If he builds the wall the way he built Trump Towers, he'll be using illegal immigrant labor to do it. A lot of these positions that he's now taking are new to him.
When you say crazy zealot, are you talking about you?
If he hadn't inherited $200 million, you know where Donald Trump would be right now? Selling watches in Manhattan.
I know you're embarrassed. I know you're embarrassed. But keep fighting. Keep swinging, man. Swing for the fences.
This is another area on which Donald agrees with Hillary Clinton.
We got a lot of fun up here tonight, I have to tell you. Thank you for the book.
Donald, relax.
Go ahead. I'm relaxed. You're the basket case.
Did he just call him a basket case?
Indeed he did.
I'm sorry, but as a foreigner looking in, this is insane. What's going on, Richard?
Welcome to American political presidential elections. It doesn't get any better than this.
Or worse.
Or worse. I think it's hilarious and entertaining. And I think here's the thing. What Donald Trump has figured out is that we live in a new America, right? Because of reality television, because of social media, because of the 24-hour news cycle, this actually works for him. This builds what some would call momentum for him. And if you look at and I think, so as you're watching this, the two other guys, Marco Rubio and Ted Cruz, they're sort of vying to be the possible nominee. But right now, they're not winning. I mean, if you look at all the polls, right, even in Marco Rubio's home state of Florida, where he is the senator, he is behind almost 10 points to Donald Trump. Donald Trump has figured out how to tap into a group of voters, and he knows how to engage them, he knows how to empower them, and he knows how to get them out to the polls. These other two candidates, they have not figured that out yet, and that's why I think Donald Trump most likely will be the Republican nominee.
That was my next question. So he's going to be the nominee for the Republican Party of the White House?
Most likely, unless there is divine intervention, or we go to what some call a quote-unquote brokered convention, which is what I think all of us in the political game are like, yes, brokered convention, brokered convention. But for the Republican Party, a brokered convention could be devastating going into a general election against either Hillary Clinton or Bernie Sanders, when the Democrats will coalesce around a candidate in the next 30 to 60 days.
So we have Super Tuesday coming up, which is where 12 states and territories all vote at the same time. You think Donald Trump would basically have it wrapped up by then?
Oh, I think he does. I think so. Ted Cruz in Super Tuesday, because of money, right? Ted Cruz will focus on trying to win Texas because he needs to get a win under his belt.
Home state.
Home state, right? Marco Rubio is going to strategically should plant himself in the state where he has the best likelihood of winning. Even in that case where Ted Cruz wins Texas and Marco Rubio picks whatever state he wants out of the 12 to go for, the other 10 are pretty much up for grabs, and in all of them, Donald Trump is up by anywhere in the neck of the woods from 5 to 10 to 15 to some places 20 points.
Okay, what about the other side? A bit more of a civil race, but we've got Hillary Clinton in the race of her life against Bernie Sanders. I mean, it's been a lot closer than people thought. Is she likely to wrap up the nomination Super Tuesday?
No, I think this will go past Super Tuesday for the Clinton campaign. And the reason why is because Hillary Clinton is, and I think what she sort of rejiggered her campaign a little bit. You see her changing from the I, me, to we, us, us. And that is what Bernie Sanders has sort of pushed her to do. And Bernie Sanders has pushed her.
And she's been campaigning, like, on the ground a lot.
Exactly. She's been on the ground, and she's been pushed to the left by Bernie Sanders. Because what Bernie Sanders has done is he's tapped into the aspiration of younger people. He's tapped into the aspiration of working families. Hillary Clinton, there's no question that when she comes to Washington, she's going to be able to get the job done. What she's got to do on the campaign trail is show Democratic voters that she feels their pain and she cares about them. And that's what she's discovering once again, as she didn't do in 2008. This time, I think she's going to get it done.
A Hillary Clinton-Donald Trump matchup for the general would be a journalist dream, but I don't know about America. I want to get everyone else's opinion on this, because this is truly getting global attention. Simon Cowey in Brazil, you talked about domestic problems in Brazil, but they must be looking at the American election going, what's going on?
Well, absolutely. There's actually quite a lot of support, especially on Brazilian social media, for Bernie Sanders at the moment. There's less criticism of Trump online, but there's definitely a lot of support for Bernie Sanders. And
is that because of his socialist?
It's mainly on social media at the moment.
Is it mainly because of his socialist ideas?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, people are making comparisons with Lula, the former president of Brazil, who was the first working-class president of Brazil. And yeah, there's a lot of traction on social media talking good stuff about Bernie Sanders, less bad stuff about Mr. Trump, which I've seen on English and American social media, and less mocking memes, this kind of thing. But there's a lot of positive traction about Mr. Sanders online in Brazilian social media, totally.
Cristina Escobar in Havana. I know it's not really shown American media in Havana, but I also know that everyone watches it. What's the view in Havana?
Well, of course, all of this that you were talking about the elections is being watched very closely in Cuba, taking into consideration that we care even more than before who's going to win and who's going to be in the White House in January 2017. And what I've been seeing, and Cuban has a high political culture in this sense, and we've been watching the American politics for a while now, that there's quite a crisis that shows the fact that it meant that, like Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders, the extreme phases of a process of discontent towards the establishment, are actually ruling these, at least liking of the people, of the polls. But the thing is that it looks like elections is more about who yells the most, who speaks faster, and who's more time on TV, and not about the essential stuff. And I've seen that even though Bernie Sanders questions some interesting ideas in the American politics scenario, Donald Trump doesn't know a lot of things about how the U.S. works or even the international community works, and he's actually ruling the polls. I think in any case, the best choice for the Cuban situation, for the path to normalization, would be a Democrat president, and even though Donald Trump is the only GOP candidate that has said that supports Barack Obama's policy about lifting the embargo, not because he knows a lot about it, but because he believes that the Cuba is an opportunity for business, and he's a businessman.
That's really interesting what you said, because the two other rivals of Donald Trump are Cuban Americans. Marco Rubio's parents came from Cuba. Ted Cruz's parents came from Cuba. I've never seen two Cuban in the race, and yet you reject them. Why?
It's quite an interesting question, because it's very interesting why the two Cubans are the ones that are against having normal relations between U.S. and Cuba. The two Cubans are the most that strongly oppose most to this, and it has to do with the fact that they represent a generation of Cubans that left in the 60s after the nationalization process of the revolution during the 60s. Nationalizations that are, by the way, now being discussed about the claims and about what Cuba should pay, and by the way, what the U.S. should pay because of the damages of the embargo during all these years. But of course, Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio are the prodigal sons of this generation, even though none of them have been in Cuba and none of them know a thing about what's going on in Cuba. Marco Rubio shows that he doesn't know what's going on in Cuba. Marco Rubio is more related to Florida because he's from Florida, but in any case, and this is quite interesting, he doesn't represent the majority of the Cuban Americans in Florida, taking into consideration that according to every poll, the Cuban Americans are in favor of lifting the embargo and in favor of normalization. So Marco Rubio shows that he supports, I don't know who, because it's not the Cubans.
That's such an interesting perspective, and that's why we love having everyone on from different datelines here. We always hear something different. How's this going on in China? How's this going down?
You know, the biggest issue Chinese are having with Trump is China bashing. You know, Trump always says that we're losing to China. He used to say that China, they're committing the greatest theft in world history, the cheaters. You know, this is just the nature of world trade today, right? You know, China only makes 9% of the profit of Apple, and they exported it to the U.S. It counts as Chinese export. So, you know, I agree with my colleague Christina in Cuba. That is, you know, Trump does not get to the essentials of the facts right sometimes. But on the other hand, the Chinese love celebrity awareness. Most Chinese love to watch U.S. TV shows. They're big fans of it, trust me. There's even a Trump supporter group on Weibo, China's own Twitter, that I just found out today. You know, people love the fact that he's a successful entrepreneur, and China is very market-driven nowadays, so people really look up to those who can create wealth and be successful.
It's interesting, though, that
Chinese people are really torn.
Are making the difference between a reality TV star and a politician, and not everyone here maybe is going about that. Okay, let's move on, because you know, we don't want Donald Trump to dominate this show like everyone else. Let's talk about the Zika virus and go back to Sam, because the Zika virus has really captured the world's attention. Everyone is extremely worried about it, from the World Health Organization on down. Has Brazil got its hands around this virus yet? And what is the feeling about its links to microcephaly, of course, that birth disorder, which haven't yet been proven, but there's a lot of research there?
Yeah, I mean, it's looking more and more likely every single day that this surge in microcephaly, especially in the northeast of Brazil, is connected to Zika virus. There have been some reports or some theories that this was an underreported phenomenon before. Now that obviously happens quite often in poorer regions, birth deformities and abnormalities underreported. But yeah, this is an extremely serious situation that we have right now with Zika, especially in the poorer northeastern states of Brazil, Pernambuco, Paraíba, Bahia. You know, these are places which have about a quarter of the capital, the GDP per capita that Sao Paulo does, for example. About 2 weeks ago now, we saw a mass mobilization of soldiers across the country. It was 220,000 soldiers that were going door to door, trying to raise awareness on the Zika virus, and also trying to terminate mosquito breeding sites which create mosquito-borne viruses such as Zika and dengue fever. So it's very difficult to say that Brazil has this under control at the moment, but it seems that they're certainly trying.
And obviously, you mentioned the poorer areas. This kind of exposes how much Brazil still has work to do in terms of combating poverty, the lack of healthcare, especially in the regions that you mentioned. What are they doing long term to try and combat that, given the fact that also we have the Olympics coming and obviously some worries about athletes and, of course, the massive influx of tourists and watchers you're going to have?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this epidemic, the Zika epidemic, has really exposed more than ever the huge inequalities that still exist in Brazil. During the last 15 years or so, we've seen millions, tens of millions, in fact, rise out of poverty. But there is still so much inequality in the country, and nowhere is this more apparent than in the northeast of the country. So poor people are more vulnerable to the Zika virus, especially in the northeast of the country, where middle class and rich people are more likely to live in closed apartments with air conditioning, whilst poor people are living in informal housing, which is often open. Now, historically, it's a drought-stricken region, which means that people are more likely to keep water supplies in their backyards, in their back gardens, and a small crack to the water canister can create a perfect mosquito breeding site. Also around in these regions, the healthcare services are historically deprived. The healthcare services are amongst the worst in the country. We see the highest rates of maternal and infant mortality. So this is a really serious issue in terms of affecting poor people being most affected by this issue and exposing the inequalities that remain in Brazil. Regarding the Olympics, now, the Olympics are taking place just in Rio de Janeiro city, where few growing cases, but few comparatively cases of Zika and microcephaly have taken place, have been recorded, as opposed to the northeast of the country. Now, of course, with every epidemic shadowing a huge tourist event, there will be some impacts, but the authorities and myself too, we believe that this impact is going to be minimal.
Cristina, Havana is known for its healthcare across Cuba. What are the Cubans doing about this regional crisis?
Well, there's a constant battle against the mosquito that transmits this Zika virus. And because we suffer dengue, and so we've been battling with this issue for a lot of years now. And of course, even though none case of Zika virus has been reported in Cuba, there's an increased surveillance over that in airports and in any kind of way in which could be transmitted, taking into consideration that in Cuba, as you know, the healthcare system is free, universal access, so it's not only a human problem because of the health issue, but it's also an economic problem because if it's an epidemic and it grows, could be quite a problem. Today there's this massive process of, going through every home to see if people are doing what are supposed to be doing to not have the mosquito. Is the only way to tackle this disease. There's no vaccines, there's no treatment. All you can do is, creates the conditions in which that mosquito won't grow, won't be transmitted, and won't be alive. So there's quite a movement here, massive movement in Cuba, and a lot of media attention to that in order to create a risk conscience in the population so people will be involved and will participate. It's the strongest issue that we have here, that the participation of people could make impossible the Zika virus to be transmitted, even though that doesn't mean that in some point that could be an issue, but still there's no case reported here in Cuba.
Cristina Escobar, on the Zika virus, on the changing situation in Cuba. Thank you so much. Sam Cowie in Sao Paulo as well. Thank you for insights on the Zika virus. Here in the studio, I also want to thank both our guests, Wang Guan on insights on China, of course, and much more, and Richard, for you, on the craziness that is the state of the US race for the White House. That's all we have time for. I'm Nathan King, Washington, D.C., and thanks for being with us.